So as Steve said, I'm Richard Brandon-Friedman. I use he, him pronouns, and I have two co-presenters with me today. One of them is Tayan Swafford, who is a doctoral student in the School of Social Work, and then we have Tyne Parlett, who is one of our research coordinators and research assistants. Tayan uses he, him pronouns, and Tyne uses they, them pronouns. So the first thing I would like to do would be to introduce you to the rest of what our research team is. And so we have the faculty from the School of Social Work, which is me. Then we also have faculty from the School of Medicine. Our other two core faculty on our team are Dr. Kelly Donahue, who is a psychologist within the Department of Pediatrics. And then we have Dr. Dennis Fortenberry, who is a medical doctor within the Department of Pediatrics. We also have a project coordinator that we employ to work on all of the projects that you'll hear about. The research currently supports 3 doctoral level research assistants between the various projects. So we have a lot of education going on for the next generation. We also have members of the gender diverse community. So we've made sure in the last, in our work to hire people within the gender diverse community, especially to do the interviews with the gender diverse community. And so Tyne will talk a little bit about that. I think one of the key pieces of working in community engaged research is making sure the community is represented. So I don't feel as a cisgender individual that I should be asking gender diverse people about their lives in the same way that I feel a member of their community could do. Then we also have some youth advisors. Those are gender diverse youth who have provided us feedback on some of the questions that we've asked in some of the research. Then we also have community advisors. We have some individuals from Gender Nexus and Gecko that have provided feedback at various times on the research. And we also have some people from the Trans Solutions Research and Resource Center. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tyne to talk a little bit about gender to give you just a background of the material we'll be talking about.
Thanks, Richard. Also, thank you for having me this afternoon. It's lovely to see you all. Again, my name is Tyne. My pronouns are they, them. And I just want to give you kind of a simple highlight of some of the things that feel important to define well when we're talking about this population and also how we relate to them. One of the key takeaways is that gender and sex are not synonymous, and that sex is one component of someone's gender and gender identity. And so thinking about the way that we define these, I think, is very helpful, especially when we're talking to youth who may feel an incongruence about what they've been socially conditioned to understand is their identity and where that falls within the medical scope as well. So sex is a biological construct that is determined by internal and external genitalia, as well as chromosomal patterns, of which there are quite a few. And gender is actually this social construct that we have that uses sex assigned at birth and sex, as well as gender expression and internal feelings of self to develop the roles and understandings of a person. And most of this is socially conditioned. We do this to young children and all through our lives. A really helpful thing to understand is that everyone has gender identity, and that we typically see a lot of discussion and pathological kind of conversations when those deviate from the social norms. Another helpful thing to know is terminology. Cisgender, which in Latin, right, the prefix is same, means a person whose sex assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity and also their expression to the world. So this is a congruence with what the medical community has attested at birth that a person has as far as sex. And trans, also in Latin, meaning across or spanning across, is a person who identifies as opposite on a spectrum, I guess, on the continuum of what their sex assigned at birth is. And then this kind of umbrella term of gender diversity is a person that does not align either their identity or their gender expression with what the medical community has assigned at birth. But that can fall anywhere on that on that spectrum or that continuum. You can go ahead, Richard. So this is a really kind of helpful like visual representation of some of the things that go into the identities that we all hold. And so thinking about this as a way to have conversations with people who have different identities than you is quite helpful. All of us, again, have a gender identity, a gender expression, a sex assigned at birth that's typically on our birth certificate, and we all have sexual orientation and relationship patterns. So I want to first kind of talk about the one that is the most important when we think about these youth who are in gender affirming care services, which is this idea of gender identity. You can see that representative of this rainbow in a thought bubble outside of the unicorn's head. And what this really is that internal dialogue within a person about whether they feel a congruence or a distress with how we are understanding and perceiving this person's gender, right? This is a self-attestation of knowing that says, I feel in alignment with who people say that I am, or I do not. I feel a discrepancy within my body, within the way that I'm experiencing puberty, all of these things. And while gender identity on this kind of still is representative of the social conditioning that we have within our country, calling it male, female, and or other genders, it's very important to note that even cisgender people can feel more ambiguous or androgynous in their femininity, or higher, right? Higher femininity than other standards. So thinking about the fact that gender identity is fluid, even within people who would identify as cisgender people, is very important. Gender expression, right, is how you perform the understanding you have of yourself to the external world. And so gender expression is something that we all do on a daily basis through the way that we do our hair, through the kinds of glasses that we use, through the way that we clothe our bodies, through the way that we use our voice. And so thinking about the fact that there are so many components of gender expression that help give others feedback about how we want to be perceived. Even in a person who is cisgender, these are things that can move through the scope of femininity and masculinity just based on our social perceptions of what maybe a low ponytail and a polo and khaki cargo shorts would look like on a woman, or something very tight and sheer or made of leather on a man, right? So thinking about the fact that these are things that are influenced by our gender stereotypes, but are also a way to kind of signal to the world how we feel about ourselves internally. Sex assigned at birth is something that the medical community tells us about ourselves. And typically this happens at birth with external genitalia and just a vague, like basic understanding of what's happening in an infant's body. It is more complicated than that, but it's representative of that chromosomal kind of candy looking shape that is in between the unicorn's legs. And that's really what we're talking about, right? Is a doctor's best guess at birth until there might be some sort of discrepancy later in a child's life, which is typically where we find, right, discrepancies within like secondary sex characteristics, hormonal patterns in children, and also those internal reproductive organs. And so it's also very important to understand that gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same, but they do give us a lot of feedback about how a person understands themselves. So at the same time, one of the things that we talk about in our research project is a young person's ability to understand how they relate to their own body, their own gender identity, and then also to the world. And so physical and emotional attraction also run on a continuum and are not polarized opposites, right? And so what this attraction does is it tells other people who we love, how we love people, and at the frequency in which we engage in love. And so there are a lot of different shared types of relating patterns that span heterosexuality and queerness. And so just to think about that when we think about asexuality, aromanticism, and some of the ways that we talk about the style of relating that we have. And so this kind of spans gender, but it also spans preference for the depth and the way that people arrive at intimacy. And so it's very important for children and our young people to understand that there is a difference between our own internal knowing of ourselves and our love that spans like whatever a person's assigned genitalia may mean for their own gender as well. You can go to the next slide, Richard.
Thank you so much, Tyne. As we transition from the gender unicorn into Dr. Brandon-Friedman's current research, I want us to keep in mind the importance of impact, the importance of how do the thoughts that our particular populations have, how do those thoughts, how do those feelings, how do those actions, how do those lived environments, how are they understood, how are they embraced within each of these studies? We're going to go through each of these studies one by one, and we're ready to begin with the first one. The first study was birthed from Trans Solutions Research and Resource Center in Indianapolis, Indiana. They are a comprehensive community-based organization whose goal is to remove barriers that their service users have had with housing, with employment, with education and healthcare. And that's really an outgrowth or an extension of previous work that this organization has done to explore how gender diverse people of color define safety. Their organization teamed with the Indiana University Research Group, and together they asked us to work with them to help them develop a life skills curriculum that specifically addresses social determinants of health as they've been experienced and as they've been trying to navigate housing, employment, education, healthcare, and the workforce. Over the course of the last year and a half, there were several community events that were held, and at those events, members from Trans Solutions and Indiana University conducted interviews to learn more about what skills needed to be addressed, what needs were there, what topics would be appropriate to address those skills, and to provide insight into our facilitators' covering of those topics in their work. This is a 6-month program. It is set to launch in August of 2024, and this is funded through the Indiana Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute's Trailblazer Grants. And with that, we transition to the second study. The second study takes a little bit of a different look when we think about thoughts and feelings and actions and impact, because we're focusing on how gender diverse youth are influenced, are impacted, are trying to make sense of educational institutions' betrayal. And to consider educational institutions means we also have to be recognizing of the fact that these are the same spaces and places that are ethically and legally obligated to promote gender diverse youth's well-being. But at the same time, we have to hold that intention with the reality that some of these spaces have also had policies, protocol, worldviews, and structures that have caused harm in a multitude of ways. So in this study, we interviewed gender diverse youth, we interviewed their caregivers, we interviewed people who have performed educational capacities about how educational systems have in some ways harmed or betrayed gender diverse youth, and how they have also in some ways supported gender diverse youth. The beauty of this particular project is that it allows us to get both lenses of how resilience and courage have been experienced, and gives us insight into how we can continue to journey alongside gender diverse youth as they're trying to develop that resilience and encouragement, that courage to resist institutional betrayal. We completed interviews in February of 2024 with analysis ongoing, and this was funded through the Center for Institutional Courage. My name is Tayon. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I now transitioned it to Dr. Brandon-Friedman, who will talk about the next project.
All right, thank you, Tayon. So another project that we did was developing a therapeutic group for gender diverse youth and their caregivers. So back in 2020, I had worked with an MSW student to develop a therapeutic group for gender diverse youth. A difficulty with that group was that we did a lot of the work on the back end. And so it was a lot of therapeutic work, but we didn't have a chance to engage the community very much. It was at the time of COVID. The group was developed over the spring of 2020. So we ended up doing a lot of the work just as the professionals. So the goal had been to develop a caregiver component, and that hadn't been done due to some of the chaos of that time period. So we were able to receive funding through the Charles R. Vance Chancellor's Community Scholar Program. And we use that funding to develop the caregiver component for that. And when we were able to do that, we took a step back and said, okay, we need to really involve the community. We wanted to take the time to really get into the community. And so we used some of that funding to be able to do consultations with Gender Nexus and Gecko. They were advisors on this. We went out and did some interviews with gender diverse youth and said, what are the things you would like to learn, or what would you like to talk to your family about? The goal was to both help them sort of understand their own gender, understand how to interact and discuss gender, and then help them build some skills that would be able to help them later in life. So we were able to work with these organizations to develop the group. We had run the youth group before that, so we had talked with those youth as well. And so we ran the group for the first time in the spring of 2023, and we had some really positive feedback on that. We're looking to run it again in the fall of 2024, once we have some time to look at some of the other data that we gathered during that project. And so as we're going to transition into the last study, I wanted to take a moment to clarify what this term gender-affirming care is, because the last study that Tyne is going to talk about is looking at the impact of gender-affirming care. And so I just want to make sure we have a solid base all together. So we know that there are about 300,000 youth ages 13 to 17 in the United States that identify as gender diverse. This is from some population studies looking at, just asking people, how do you identify how do you identify your gender? We also know, as many of you know on this call, that family and social recognition and affirmation of people's gender identity is some of the most important factors for psychosocial health. So if a youth is in an environment that is affirming and supportive of them, they're going to have better outcomes than if they're in an environment that is negative towards them. And so we have to look at that both on the familial level, looking at how it is in the core family that they may be living with, but then we also have to look at that in the social context, which is some of what we are doing with the project looking at schools, but then also looking at the general social context, especially at a time now when we're seeing a lot of social discussion that is very negative about gender diverse individuals. So we're trying to capture a little bit of that as well. So we also know that gender-affirming medical care improves gender-diverse individuals' mental health and their quality of life. So then, what does actually gender-affirming care look like? So gender-affirming care is an evidence-based, empirically supported medical care designed to support gender-diverse individuals as they navigate the impact of their gender identity or expression. And I think an important key piece of that is that they're navigating both themselves and, again, that social part. So one thing that you often hear about, often hear said, is that gender affirming care is all these surgeries that are being done, and that's not the case. Yes, some people do desire surgical interventions, but gender affirming care itself is much broader. So when you look at what is gender affirming care, it consists of individual psychological interventions, familial, social, behavioral, medical supports, all designed to help the gender diverse individual reduce some of the gender dysphoria that they're feeling. So on a very, base level, this could be just helping someone be able to assert the name they want to be called. So that is a critical component. And then you have that in a social component, then you can work on like getting that changed legally. You can talk to caregivers and help caregivers address some of their feelings. We also look at then, of course, the medical components, which are what you hear about a lot, but I just want to make sure everyone's clear that that is not all gender affirming care is. And so it's also important to recognize that gender affirming care is individualized. If you think back to that gender unicorn, there was that entire spectrum of it. And no one's going to be in the exact same spot on all of those pieces, especially if you're looking at gender identity versus gender expression, and then gender portrayal, the way they may act versus the way they express themselves visually. So everyone has their own unique gender identity and their own unique gender portrayal. And so when you look at gender affirming care, it is also very individualized. So if a youth were to come to a gender affirming care clinic, the first thing people are going to ask when they're engaging, or first thing the clinicians are going to ask is, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Because it could be, again, just the name. It could be, you know what, I'm having a little bit of trouble processing this, and so I would just like a little bit of therapy. Or it could be anywhere in terms of looking at the hormone interventions, or once people are over 18, looking at surgical interventions and components of that. But it's really important to recognize that this is a very individualized process that is done in a very complex set of conversations with the family to ensure that what they're receiving is what's best for them and what they desire, so they're fully informed on that. And so Tyne is going to talk a little bit now about the research project that we are doing looking at gender affirming care.
Thanks, Richard. So kind of making some nuance to what Richard is talking about when we think about gender affirming care. The study that I have the honor to be able to speak to young people and their caregivers on evaluates what the impact of gender affirming care is on these youth, how they participate in their families, and the ways in which their caregivers also experience any and all of these components changing for their young person. And so we are diligently looking at psychological well-being, changes in mental health, and how mental health relates to outward perceptions that the youth is picking up from people, and also that internal dialogue of distress and incongruence within their body. We're also looking at familial support, whether that is children who are living with biological parents or being caretaken by different diverse people within their lives. We're asking the same sets of questions. We're also looking at social and educational well-being, and that includes perceptions of safety, as well as how often are people understanding who you are and being allies when maybe microaggressions or actual aggression is happening. And one of my favorite things as a person who these youth see as another part of the community are these deep discussions of gender identity development and how they are able to speak to, right, what things give them hope and resilience, which things in their body give them incongruence, how we are making practices to alleviate those things, whether it's medical, medicinal, or non-medical entirely. And then we're talking about their perception of connection to the LGBTQ community and thinking about how that changes based on their location within the state. You can go to the next slide, Richard. So what we have currently are 54 diverse youth and 70 caregivers. Some of our youth have maybe one caregiver that is enrolled. Some have three, depending on the network of their family and who decided that they wanted to speak to this. And this is 2 years of data collection, which I can tell you as a person who's followed some of these youth creates a depth, right? A depth of change, and even just maturity that I'm so excited to see. And so we give interviews with standardized scales that start 4 months into the program, or at the beginning and intake of their sessions at 4 months, 8 months, 12 months, 16, 20, and 24 months. And the interviews are the initial interview, as well as 4, 8, 16, and 24 months. And those are the interviews that I get to conduct with both caregivers and youth to talk about what are the things that are changing? How are these goals moving for you? What are the things that are still creating either distress, unease, or trepidation? And what are the things that feel resolved and feel like they are settling within your life? And so I want to share just kind of some of the salient information that I continue to hear over and over again in these interviews. One of these is a huge one that Richard just kind of spoke to, which is this idea that some of these kids are only receiving mental health support and seeing professionals within the gender health program. And a massive part of what I am being reported about the experiences at the gender health program being is I see adults who look like me, who have gender diversity, who have lived through their childhood and made it into professions. There are people like me who I see that are adults. And it's not something I expected to hear in the research, but it's something that I think is a really beautiful component. Another thing that feels really salient is that these supportive parents that we have are talking about the fact that support for other gender diverse youth in their children's life is nearly non-existent, and they have become kind of proxy parents to other youth whose parents are not supportive. And I think one of the most important things that I have heard from nearly everyone who I have spoken to is that beginning the process at the gender health program, whether that is slow, whether that is fast, whether it's at 11 or it's at 17, just beginning the process has started to decrease the amount of emotional and physical anguish about dysphoria and some concerns about their believability. It's the clinicians using their pronouns. It's the clinicians believing that they understand about their own bodies. And so even some of the youth who have a list a mile long of things that they want as goals, but understand are not things that they can get very soon, right, are still reporting, I feel lower levels of distress within my body and within my family and my social situations because I am enrolled in this program. So one of the really influential comments that we had in one of our interviews is something that we're going to share with you. And this is a first interview, right? So brand new person to gender affirming care. And this young person said, "It's gotten a lot better the way I feel about myself. It used to be such a source of distress. Like I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I showered with the lights off for months at a time because I just couldn't look at myself. It caused me so much anxiety and despair. It is almost felt like grief. It was just so strong that I couldn't see myself as the person that I thought that I was." And so when we think about this being such a transformational time, development-wise, right, in a young person's life, and we think about this added layer of dysphoria and then a very political stance about what gender affirming care looks like, right? Children are understanding that this is their bodies by virtue are political because of the nature of these conversations that we're having. And so knowing that at a first visit, just a couple months into the process, maybe with a parent, this person is able to shower, able to go through life, able to engage in hope practices, able to go to school, is something that I think we're really proud of. And I think Richard is going to share next a little bit more.
Richard, you're muted.
All right, sorry about that. So I was wanted to just give a little wrap up. Here is all of our contact information. I forgot to say this at the beginning, but there is a QR code there that links to a folder. In the folder, we have the slides. We also have another set of slides that I created that has some resources. It's got some books for little youth and then more like younger or teens, youth. So we have the really littles, even including board books, and then teens. And then we have some books for adults who are looking to understand more from a experiential aspect. So looking at some of the memoirs. And then we also have a couple slides that provide resources for clinicians. So there's a lot of things about how to, best practices for conducting therapy or clinical services with gender diverse individuals. So that is all in the QR code. There's also a couple handouts in there of crises resources for gender diverse youth. This research gives us a lot of insight into the world of these youth, and whether it's looking at, what's going on in school, or if it's looking at, what are those life skills that they haven't haven't learned and therefore they're struggling, or if they're not able to talk to their parents, or then like what is going on with the care. We get some of that insight, which is, as Tyne called it, I mean, it's a privilege, especially as someone who is cisgender and is asking these youth to help me understand their lives. And so I really value all of that experience. And with that, we also know that a lot of these youth are experiencing a lot of trauma and uncertainty right now. And so some of the resources in there provide just local resources and then national resources. I will never do a presentation without promoting the Trevor Project, which is a LGBT youth hotline that is absolutely wonderful. So anytime the resource is in there, but anytime you have a youth that is struggling, LGBT youth, the Trevor Project is an amazing resource. And so I just wanted to, wrap up. Again, we had done the work with Trans Solutions, which was starting with looking at safety, how people of color define safety. Then we started to look at their building their life skills. We've also developed the therapeutic group for gender diverse youth and their families or their caregivers. We've then done the work looking at the educational well-being and how institutions are impacting youth. And then we've got the impact of gender affirming care, which altogether is really designed to try and understand the experiences of gender diverse youth in Indiana and everything that's going on in their lives. And so I think now we have some time for some questions.
So this is the opportunity and invitation to all of the folks that are here with us to turn on your camera, raise your hand, unmute, put a comment in the chat. Richard, I think we'll ask you to stop sharing your screen. The resource is available in the chat as well, and that way we can see each other. And let's see, this sounds like really important research. Did you see what's being funded? Is there more? Maybe this is somebody who's interested in helping. I don't know. Could be, huh?
So we talked, as you said, a little bit about that. Some of these research projects had some internal funding through IU. So we had the Center for Translational Sciences funded one of the projects, the Trailblazer. The other one was funded through the BANTS grant and the Center for Institutional Courage. The large project is funded in a variety of ways. It is funded, we had some internal funding that came through IU. We had some funding that another faculty member provided. And then honestly, a good amount of that project is being funded through individual donations. We've had families that have donated, families who have heard about the research or knew a gender diverse youth and wanted to support the research. We did have some funding from a foundation that promotes working with gender diverse individuals. But again, a lot of it has been individual funding. So I think when I was copying all the files into there, I'm not sure if I copied one. I copied an entire folder, and the folder may have actually the fundraising flyer in there. In case you do have extra money and would like to supply it, we do have the 2 years is our goal. We are, honestly, to be completely honest, a little short to finish our last year, but that is how we're doing a lot of this funding. It is hard to fund some of this research. Political environment does not support this research right now, and so it is really difficult to actually get some of those funds, although we have done, again, really well with some of the resources that IU has been able to put out. Tyne, I think this one's going to come to you.
Yeah.
The question is, someone said their bodies are political. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you for this question, Kathleen. I think so I'm going to answer this as nuanced as I possibly can, because I think it's important to think about what these young people have to consider every step of the way, including coming out, asking for services, talking to family, deciding if they are going to come out at school or not. And so what I mean by their bodies are political is this. So when we ask the determination question of like, what do you think other gender diverse youth are going through right now? Nearly every single one says unaffirming parents. And one of the questions that I like to ask is, you know, we ask why, right? Why would that be a barrier? And a lot of young people say that either the youth have heard the types of news that their family listens to, the things that are happening on Sunday morning in a pulpit, right? And the ways that they speak about other marginalized groups. And so they are afraid that they will not be accepted. Then there's another large portion of youth who have come out and their parents have said, trans isn't a thing. I'm absolutely not going to do that. If you want to live here, we are not going to have this discussion. So there's this kind of either implicit bias that these children are kind of swimming inside of with what kind of social location their parents might be in, or this overt denial of parents that this identity is something that is okay with them. And so when we think about a body being political, right, name and gender marker changes have to be affirmed by the state. You have to have, in some cases, two parents that agree with you about your gender identity to receive care. There are all of these ways, right, that children are making decisions about where it is safe to be out and where it is safer to be closeted, including in school. There's a large population of high schoolers that I've spoken to who have been in care for months, even years, and are in a very full-blown process of gender-affirming care, but have decided school's not a safe place for me to do that. So they've either transitioned online or they've kept everything the same, knowing that at some point, someday in college, it will be okay for me to come out. And so when I say the body is political, what I mean is that these gender diverse youth understand that they are under a microscope by medical institutions, by social institutions, by religious institutions, and by basically everyone. And everyone has a vested weigh in on either the believability of what they're experiencing or how to change their perspective of their own suffering. And so some of these youth say, I stay off social media. I don't watch TikTok. It's hard for my self-image. It's hard for my self-efficacy. But they're very aware that that doesn't mean that everyone around them isn't swimming in that consciousness. And so they are making calculated decisions about their safety and their identity that I'm not even sure that some adults have ever had to think about, let alone while you're in, going through puberty and trying to be in marching band, So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I appreciate the clarity that the three of you are bringing to understanding all of these issues and to highlight the importance of thinking about this from children who are young and developing. And I also want to add that this is such a wonderful example of community engaged collaborative research, and you're leading by example by doing this. It would have been great to have those voices here, but I think the way you've incorporated that certainly allows us to have a better understanding. And it might lead us to a question about, well, what do we do about this? You've identified some of the challenges, and I think are all aware we're in a challenging time around politics and environment. But so what are you learning about this, and what recommendations do you have for communities to support these young people or whoever that may be struggling with these issues?
I'll start from the academic viewpoint, and then maybe Tayan can talk a little about clinical, and then Tyne can talk about, on the ground components. So, part of the goal of the research is to document the benefits of all of these aspects or the harms of it. So if you look at some of the work on the educational institutions, the goal is to be able to go back to schools and say, hey, this is what's going on from your youth. This is not what I'm saying. This is not what someone else is saying. This is something said by an Indiana youth right here in Indiana, this is what's happening. Now, of course, we don't know exactly which school, but we can say this is what's going on here. And, it's not just this, hypothetical thing. And I think that's giving, ground level action items, because one of the questions we always ask is, what are your advice? What would you say to a teacher if they came to you and said, Richard, you're a gender diverse youth, and I know there's difficulties. What would you suggest? So we give the youth the space to say that, so then we can be the ones who can use our adult power privilege to be able to go to other adults and say, okay, we really should listen to them. And the other things are, with the defining safety, one of the goals was to understand it, because you can provide the best services, but if people don't feel safe coming, then they're not coming. You could be like, I am the most amazing clinician. I have all the credentials. I'm an amazing therapist. But if they don't feel safe sitting in my waiting room because of something, then they're not coming to me in the first place. And so some of that is giving real practical answers. The impact of gender affirming care is interesting because, as we all know, Indiana changed some of the laws quite recently, which has done a little bit of a mix up with our research, because some of the interventions that were being done for some of these youth are now illegal under Indiana law. So we were going to be tracking the impact of these things long term. One of the shifts we've had to do is, to some degree, for some of these youth, we're tracking the impact of withdrawing from those interventions. So whereas we were hoping to build a lot of data on look at all this progress, so now we have some pieces of, well, look at the progress that has now gone back. So it's a horrible situation for the youth. We are fortunate to have some of those relationships with the youth at this point to be able to ask them how they're experiencing this. So we try to make the best of that situation, and we also have the ability to understand what's going on with the youth. We started with 54 youth. We have one that's left Indiana. We have a couple that are planning to leave. We have one that's moved to Canada, and we're tracking these youth, and all of those that I just said have attributed specifically to the gender affirming care laws. So again, that's not just these hypothetical things. These are Indiana youth that are experiencing that.
And to follow with that, thinking about that from a clinical perspective, we can start to ask the questions of, who are we as an institution? Who are we as the services that we're able to provide to and for gender diverse youth, to or for younger adults as they're transitioning from their teenage into their younger years? And how do we journey and walk alongside these communities and those with whom they are living and sharing life to try to better understand the depths of their lived experiences? So in addition to being a doctoral student, I'm also the director of mental health at a small clinic in Westfield at Heart and Soul Clinic. And at that clinic, we spend a lot of time working with people on this question of, who am I? Who am I to myself? Who am I to other people? How am I receiving myself? How am I receiving other people? And how are other people receiving me, treating me? And to what extent is that important to me? How does that impact with my values? And one of the biggest lessons that comes up, regardless of with whom I'm speaking or one of the interns is speaking, is that life is always changing and we're having to rearrange. So we do a lot of work in, what does that rearrangement look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? The majority of my academic work rests in the intersection of gender, religious, sexual, and spiritual identity development. And it's in those spaces that we can make a recommendation to consider wholeness. What does wholeness mean for each and every individual with whom we're doing our work? And how is that wholeness experience in all of the arenas in which they're going in and out of on a daily basis? When I think about the Trans Solutions Research and Resource Center project, that one really speaks to my spirit, because we're not only dealing with this reality of I'm having to understand safety beyond the physical, because safety is much more than physical, but the participants are also dealing with this compound marginalization of identifying as Black, African American, and identifying as as some version of gender diverse on that spectrum, and identifying as religious or not non-religious, and identifying as spiritual, non-spiritual. So they're trying to make sense of all of that. And one of the questions that kept coming up is, so what do we do? So what we do is we come in and begin with some solution focused ideas. And so having this curriculum is a way to try to address some of those immediate life skills needs. But then we can also transition into this wholeness of how do I not just see myself, but how do I embrace and embody who I am so that in every space wherein I'm living my life and doing my work, I am identifying, I am experiencing, and I am being my whole self without any conditions or limitations placed upon me internally and or externally.
Well, thank you. I do want to take a pause right here. I know we have a few more things to chat about, but it is getting to the top of the hour, and we know that folks have other obligations at the top of the hour. So I always like to take a pause. Thank our folks today. Richard, thank you for coming in and chatting and bringing along a couple of colleagues to bring this to life and to help us talk about translational research that's community engaged. And we will hang out here for a few minutes. We're going to stay and chat if you're able to stay and would like to have a little more conversation. But for those that need to go, we thank you for coming and participating. Reminder, you're going to get a follow-up email with some resources, but also that invitation to participate in a survey to get your thoughts about today. And please come join us again for some other topics that we've got lots going on at the Center for Translating Research into Practice. So thank you all for coming, but let's get back to our conversation for those that are able to stay and continue for a few more moments.